You know, people always talk about the end quote, American dream end quote, like it's this white picket fence and a perfectly manicured lawn. But let me tell you something. After what my family went through last summer, that picket fence starts to look a lot more like a cage. And those manicured lawns? They're just burying the rot underneath. It all started on a Tuesday, one of those thick, humid July mornings in Virginia where the air feels like a wet wool blanket. And I was just sitting there in the kitchen, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and wondering if I should mow the grass before the HOA sent me another one of their passive-aggressive and quote, reminders, and quote. My wife, Elena, was humming some tune while she scrambled eggs, and our 15-year-old son, Leo, was still dead to the world upstairs, probably dreaming about whatever video game he'd stayed up too late playing. Everything felt normal, boring even, until the first bang hit the door. And I don't mean a knock, I mean a quote. The frame is about to splinter and quote, kind of thud that made Elena drop her spatula and sent my heart straight in my throat. I stood up, my chair screeching against the tile, and before I could even get a quote, who is it? End quote. Out, another round of pounding shook the house, followed by a voice that sounded like it had been gargling gravel. End quote. Open up. Community Compliance Task Force. We have a signed order for an immediate youth welfare inspection. Open this door, or we will escalate to forced entry. End quote. Now, I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I know our HOA, the end quote, Oak Creek Estates Board, end quote, is run by a bunch of power-tripping retirees who have nothing better to do than measure the height of your mailbox. But end quote, Community Compliance Task Force, end quote. That was new, and it sounded wrong, instinctively, dangerously wrong. I looked at Elena. Her face had gone completely white, and she whispered my name, end quote, Caleb, Don and Appos, T, end quote. But the instinct to protect my house took over, and I walked to that door, my hands trembling just a bit as I pulled back the deadbolt. The second that door cracked open, it was like a dam broke. For men, and I used the term end quote, men end quote, loosely because they looked more like human-shaped slabs of granite, shoved their way onto my porch, wearing these navy blue tactical vests with end quote, HOA compliance end quote, printed in bright, offensive yellow letters across the back. The guy in the lead had a buzz cut so tight his scalp looked angry, and eyes that were just empty, like two holes burned into a sheet of paper, and he didn't Appos to even look at me. He just held up a laminated sheet of paper and barked, end quote. Clause 14, Section C of the amended bylaws. Safety and welfare checks on minors are mandatory when a violation of community conduct is suspected. Where's the boy? End quote. I felt this surge of hot, oily rage bubbling up, because who the hell are these people to talk about my son? But before I could even get my breath back to tell them to get bent, two of them brushed past me like I was an Appos. T even there, their boots heavy and disrespectful on the hardwood floor I'd spent 3 weekends refinishing. End quote, Leo. Get down here now. End quote. One of them yelled, and I turned around, shouting for them to stop, but it was chaos. Elena was screaming, was trying to grab the lead guy in Appos' arm, and then I saw Leo at the top of the stairs, looking so small in his oversized t-shirt, rubbing sleep out of his eyes, and looking completely terrified. End quote, Dad? What in Appos? S happening? End quote. He asked, his voice cracking, and that was the last thing he got out before the two thugs reached the landing, grabbed him by the upper arms, and literally started dragging him down the stairs. They weren't into Appos. T being careful, they weren't into Appos. T being, end quote, official, end quote. They were being brutal, and as Leo's heels clicked against the wood, I saw the bruises already forming where their thick, tattooed fingers were digging into his skin. I lunged for them. I didn't care that they were twice my size or that they looked like they'd spent the last decade in a cage fighting ring. But the lead guy, the one with the end quote, compliance end quote, badge, stepped into my path and slammed a palm into my chest, sending me reeling back against the wall. End quote. Stay back, sir. Interference with a board-sanctioned welfare check is a felony-level community violation. End quote. He hissed, his breath smelling like stale coffee and something metallic, and, for a second, I felt completely paralyzed. You think you'd be a hero in that moment, but when the world turns upside down and people are quoting laws at you while stealing your child, your brain just short-circuits. They dragged Leo out onto the front porch, and the neighborhood was already waking up which made the whole thing feel like some sick piece of theater. I could see old Mr. Henderson across the street, standing there with his morning paper, just staring, and Mrs. Gable was filming the whole thing on her phone from her driveway. And quote, "Help us," and quote, Elena was sobbing, running out after them, and quote, "They and Oppos, retaking our son, call the police," and quote, but the lead guy just turned to the crowd, waved that stupid laminated paper, and shouted in quote, "Official HOA business, underage safety protocol, move along," end quote. And the crazy part? The truly heartbreaking, sickening part? People stopped. They lowered their phones. They looked at each other, and they stayed back. Because in a place like Oak Creek, if the HOA says it's in quote, official in quote, people treat it like the word of God, even if they're watching a kid get kidnapped in broad daylight. The thugs were throwing Leo toward the back of a blacked-out SUV that was idling at the curb, and Leo was fighting now, kicking and screaming for me. And I felt this cold, dead weight in my stomach because I just knew, that if he got into that car, I was never going to see him again. I started to scramble up, ready to go out swinging, even if it meant they kill me right there on the lawn. But then the heavy oak door of my guest house, the one I'd been letting my old Army buddies stay in for our annual reunion weekend, creaked open, and the air in the neighborhood just shifted. Out stepped Miller, Jax, and Ghost three guys who don in Oppos. T looked like much at first glance, just guys in faded t-shirts and cargo shorts, holding their morning mugs. But if you know what to look for, you see the way they move, the way they don into Oppos. To even have to look at each other to know exactly where the other two are. They're Navy SEALs, or they were, and Len Oppos. Let's just say you don Oppos. T really ever stop being a SEAL? Miller, the tallest one, took a slow sip of his coffee, looked at the thugs who were currently trying to shove my son into a vehicle, and said in a voice that was terrifyingly quiet, "You boys seem to have lost your way. This ISN into Oppos, a playground, and that kid ISN into Oppos, tears to play with," The lead inspector sneered, clearly not realizing he was looking at three of the most dangerous human beings on the planet, and barked "Get back inside. This is authorized HOA business, Don and Oppos. T make us add you to the report," Ghost, who's the shortest of the three but has eyes like a shark, just smiled. It was a thin, predatory thing, and set his mug down on the porch railing, and "Report this," he whispered, and it was like watching a movie at 2x speed. Miller didn't in Oppos. T run. He flowed. He was across the lawn in 3 strides, his hand snapping out like a whip, grabbing the guy holding Leo's left arm and twisting it in a way that made a sound like dry kindling snapping. The thug let out a high-pitched wail and hit the grass, his arm dangling at an angle that arm shooed in Oppos. T dangle at. Jax and Ghost were right behind him. Jax took the one by the SUV, and I didn't in Oppos. To even see the punch, I just heard the thud of a fist hitting a solar plexus, and suddenly this 250-pound gorilla was folded over, gasping for air that wasn't into Oppos. T coming. The lead guy tried to pull something from his waistband. Maybe a taser, maybe a gun. I didn't in Oppos. T stay to find out. But Ghost was already on him, spinning him around and slamming his face into the brick pillar of my porch with a sickening crack. It was. Over in less than 15 seconds, 4 inspectors were on the ground, groaning and bleeding, and Leo was sprinting back into my arms, shaking so hard I could feel his heart hammering against my chest like a trapped bird. The neighbors were screaming now, but for a different reason, they and Oppos, re-killing the officers. Call the real police, and Mrs. Gable was shrieking. Miller just stood there, wiped a bit of dust off his shorts, and looked at me, and "You okay, Caleb?" and he asked, as if he'd just helped me move a couch instead of dismantling a kidnapping ring. And then the siren started. Real sirens this time, and 4 cruisers from the county sheriff's office came screaming around the corner, followed by 2 black Suburbans that didn't into Oppos. T have any markings at all? I thought, and "Great, now we in Oppos. We all going to jail," and but as the deputies jumped out with their weapons drawn, Miller didn't in Oppos. T put his hands up. He just reached into his back pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to show a badge that made the lead deputy freeze mid-step. End quote. Commander Miller, JSOC Task Force, end quote. He said, his voice carrying over the noise. End quote. These 4 suspects are part of a multi-state human trafficking ring we in Oppos. We've been tracking for 6 months. They use HOA and Oppos, compliance and Oppos, and fake municipal paperwork to target families in high-income, low-crime areas where neighbors are too polite or too scared to interfere. We were using this house as a tactical waypoint, but it seems they decided to move up their timeline today. And, quote, you could have heard a pin drop. I looked at the men on the ground. Men who had looked so imposing 10 minutes ago, and now they just looked like what they were, predators who had accidentally walked into a lion and Oppos. Den. But as the Fed started loading them into the Suburbans, Miller walked over to me, his face turning serious, and he leaned in close, and quote, Caleb, you need to understand something. These guys didn't in Oppos. T picked this house out of a hat. They had a list. They had schedules. They knew exactly when your son would be home alone next week. Someone gave them the keys to your life, end quote. I felt a new kind of chill, one that didn't in Oppos. T go away when the sun came out. And that's when I saw him, Mr. Harris, the HOA president, standing at the edge of his driveway, 3 houses down. He wasn't in Oppos. T looking at the criminals, he wasn't in Oppos. T looking at the police, he was looking at me. And for the first time in 12 years, I saw the mask slip. He didn't in Oppos. T looked like a concerned neighbor or a picky retiree. He looked like a man who had just seen his retirement fund get hauled away in handcuffs. Miller followed my gaze and nodded slowly. End quote. Yeah, we in Oppos. We're going to have a very long chat with Mr. Harris about his offshore bank accounts and why he's been selling in Oppos. Vulnerability reports in Oppos. On his own neighbors for 50 grand a pop. End quote. The next few weeks were a blur of depositions, FBI interviews, and a neighborhood that suddenly went very, very quiet. Harris disappeared. Legal fees and federal indictments have a way of doing that. And then, quote, Oak Creek Estates Board, end quote, was essentially dissolved overnight as people realized they'd been paying monthly dues to a man who was literally scouting their children for the highest bidder. But the thing that sticks with me, the thing that keeps me up at night, ISN and Oppos. T the thugs, or the fight, or even the betrayal by the guy across the street. It's the way the other neighbors reacted, the way they saw something horrific happening and chose to believe the, end quote, official, end quote, version because it was easier than standing up. It made me realize that, end quote, community, end quote, is a very thin veneer, and when things get ugly, you really only have the people who are willing to bleed for you. We ended up moving a few months later. Kuden and Oppos. T stand the way the new neighbors looked at us, like we were some kind of reminder of the darkness they wanted to forget. And we live out in the country now where the only, end quote, bylaws, end quote, are common sense and a good fence. Leo's doing better, though he still checks the locks 3 times before bed. And I still keep in touch with Miller and the guys. They saved my son's life, but more than that, they woke me up to the fact that the people who claim to be protecting your, end quote, standards, end quote, are often the ones you need to be protected from the most. So, I have to ask you guys, how well do you actually know the people running your neighborhood? If someone knocked on your door tomorrow with a, end quote, signed order, end quote, and a badge, would your neighbors help you? Or would they just record it on their phones and wait for the, end quote, official, end quote, explanation? Because let me tell you, when the world comes for your family, a, end quote, Clause 14, Section C, end quote, ISN and Oppos, T gonna save you. You better hope you have some real friends in the guest house. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a run-in with an HOA that felt a little too, end quote, authoritative, end quote, or if you think I was right to let my buddies handle it the way they did. Some people say the SEALs went too far, that we should have waited for the, end quote, proper channels, end quote, but when in Oppos, it's your kid in Oppos, hand on that car door, end quote, proper channels, end quote, feel a lot like a death sentence. What would you have done?